Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hai Nguyen. And again, guys, this is it, right? This is it, the final exam for the class. This might be the last video that you will have to watch in this class. So with that said, if you are watching this video, it means that you have probably made it through the class and completed the 10 modules, the 2 exams, and the 1 book review. So congratulations for making it this far in an online history course in a community college, especially mine. I know it hasn't been an easy task for you, and I didn't design my class to be. Again, this class has been a lot of reading and writing, right? Over the semester, you have done, I would say, more than 70 pages of writing, and you have read not only 1, but 2 books, right, in your somewhat study of American histories. And that's not including all the primary resources that you have read and analyzed, but also the videos that you have watched throughout this course. So I really do mean it to say congratulations for making this far. However, that is not to say that the task is done, for you still have 1 more assignment to complete. And what you have done so far in preparation for this exam is module 9 and 10. Covering American history from the end of World War II and to the end of the Cold War. So from 1945 to 1991. And I hope you have enjoyed what you have learned in module 9 and 10, including various topics like the civil rights movement, looking at the roots of the Cold War, if you will. And particular in some of the assignments, you watch the My Lai documentary on the Vietnam War, which is a personal topic for me, a personal interest for me, since I am Vietnamese and my families and myself wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Vietnam War. Also in module number 10, you looked at the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment during the women liberation movement. And some of the issues that were being addressed within that debate in terms of access to education, access to sports, drafting women to the military, and also equal pay continues to be a divisive issue up until today, especially the issue over access to contraceptives and abortion rights. So you have done a lot of things, right, in preparation for this assignment. So that's what you have been doing. And now the time has come to ultimately test your knowledge and try to put all the pieces together in another document-based question essay exam. So in this video, I want to keep it short. I don't want to talk about the format of the test, because again, this is not the first, also this is not the second time, but this is the 3rd time that you have done this test. And by now, if you made it this far, then you know quite well what I expect for you to do, what in terms of using the documents, at least 6 out of the 8, incorporating all of the key terms, and you have to be detailed. You have to address the question directly and clearly, right? And your essay itself has to be organized in an effective manner. So in this video, I want to, again, do the same thing as I did in other videos, explaining to you the objectives of the assignment, key concepts, and what to pay attention to in terms of the documents. And last but not least, how I would somewhat recommend to write your essay, right? The structure, how I would approach this assignment, because I noticed that in the second midterm, some of you didn't really follow my instructions. Is as clear as I made it in the video, how I think this is the most effective way to address this question. Some of you didn't really follow that. Now, whether that may be because you didn't watch the video, this tutorial video, may I remind you again that this video is mandatory. It is your responsibility to review this video to understand exactly what I expect you to do. So If you're watching this video, good job. You're on the path to success, if you will. But again, that's what I want to do in this video. I want to explain to you what the question is about, what the documents are about, and ultimately how I would somewhat approach this assignment. And I feel that if you follow my instructions, if you follow my recommendations, and you put in the work and the level of details, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna be doing excellent in the class, right? So at the end of the day, this is what the video is about. So I want to dive right in here. I want to talk about somewhat the essay prompt itself. Okay. So here you have the essay prompt, and the essay prompt is asking you to discuss and define, explain in detail the successes, failures of the policy of containment against communism overseas established by the Truman Doctrine during the Cold War, 1947 to 1991, and analyze how the Cold War influenced and inspired both the civil rights movement and the rise of conservatism with the new right in America. Okay, so I feel this one is a very straightforward essay prompt, right? It's asking you to discuss, define, and explain the successes and the failures of the policy under the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so basically, what is the Truman Doctrine? Look, 1947, right? Harry Truman, President Truman, he's very alarmed by what he sees, what's happening in Europe, particularly Greece and Turkey. So he gets in front of Congress and he makes this grand speech. And ultimately he says, look, there's a threat on the horizon and America has to do whatever it takes, right, to stop this threat, okay? And what he's talking about, he doesn't really call them by name, but everybody know who he's talking about. Of course, he's talking about the Soviets. He's talking about communism, right? That was spreading not only in Europe, but also throughout the world. So he gets in front of Congress, he lays out this speech, and this speech itself, right, even though it's just a speech, the speech itself lays the foundation for American foreign policies for the next 44 years to come. Every single president after Harry Truman, right, has to somewhat comply to the plans that he established, okay? Any president after Truman that is soft on communism was somewhat viewed as weak, almost like un-American, right? So priority number one during somewhat the Cold War is to stop communism. So your first task is to explain the successes and the failures of the implementation of the Truman Doctrine overseas, right? You're gonna try to figure out America's effort to contain communism overseas, whether it was successful or not, right? Through various somewhat examples, if you will. So that's what you're looking at in the first half of the essay prompt, okay? In the second half of the essay prompt, what it's asking you to do is to explain and analyze how the Cold War itself, right? Even though it's a war against communism overseas, how the war itself influenced and inspired both the civil rights movement, right, among African Americans, and also the new right movement among white Americans back at home, okay? So that's what the question is asking you to do. Now, on the surface, the question looks simple, okay? But again, I want to remind you, you have to read the question very carefully and understand all aspects of the question and what I am asking you to do. Again, the first section is about discussing, defining, and explaining the Truman Doctrine, its successes and its failures, okay? Now, I have provided you with documents, key terms, and events that will allow you to somewhat discuss both successes and failures, right, of the Truman Doctrine, okay? So you got to do both. You got to discuss successes and failures, okay? So that's in the first half. In the second half of your essay, you should be analyzing how the Cold War itself, right, the promises of the Cold War and the context of the Cold War ultimately influenced two corresponding movements back at home. One was the civil rights movement, mainly African Americans and other minorities, and the other one is dealing with the new rights. Primarily, these are religious evangelicals and nationalist white Americans in the suburbs, okay? So that's what the question is asking you to do. It's a section. One in the first section focuses on the Cold War overseas, right? And the second half of the essay prompt is dealing with the Cold War at home, right? That's what you're gonna be doing, okay? So this is where I wanna somewhat guide you through talking about how I would approach this assignment. And ultimately what I would do is I would just go in that order, right? I would just go in that order. The first half of your essay will focus on the Truman Doctrine overseas, right? America's effort to contain communism in places like what? Europe, okay? Latin America, and Asia, okay? That's the three main areas that the Truman Doctrine was established, okay? So what I would do is, in the introduction, I would take some time to define the Truman Doctrine, right? Explain what the Truman Doctrine was and the objective of the Truman Doctrine. Because in order for you to somewhat assess the successes and the failures of the Truman Doctrine, well, you have to define what the goals are, right? How do you define whether a plan succeed or not when you don't understand somewhat the parameters, you don't understand the objective, the plan, right, of the plan itself? So ultimately, in the introduction, I would talk about Harry Truman. I would talk about his fear against the rise of communism, and ultimately I would talk about the speech itself and what it lays out, okay? And since you are watching this video, okay, I will just give you the answer, is that, again, what the Truman Doctrine was basically a speech that Harry Truman gave in 1947. He's alarmed by the spreading of communism. He's alarmed by somewhat the expansion of communism in Europe, particularly in Greece and Turkey. So he goes to Congress and he asks for financial assistance to fight against communism in Greece and Turkey, okay? Now, even though he goes to Congress and he asks for financial assistance, the speech itself becomes the foundation of American policies, right, for the next 44 years to come, right? Like I said, every single president after Harry Truman has to comply to this plan, right? Every single president has to figure out, how am I going to fight against communism, right? How am I going to contain communism? So the goals of the Truman Doctrine is to contain communism, right? Is to stop communism from expand. Now, if you define that as the goal, then ultimately it makes it easier for you to figure out, okay, well, if that's the game plan, if that's the goal, then how does the Truman Doctrine in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia measure up, okay? That's what you're gonna be looking for in terms of the Truman Doctrine. So in the introduction, I would ultimately lay out, right, the parameters, the goals of the Truman Doctrine, okay? I say this is because in previous semesters when I have assigned the same question, one of the typical mistakes that students make is they don't give me a clear analysis or a clear assessment as to whether or not the events that they are describing, right, is a success or a failure. So guys, since you are watching this video, right, I am letting you know right now, do not to forget include that analysis. Okay, make it clear to me within your writing and in the paragraph. Don't just state it in the thesis statement, right? State it very clearly in your analysis, right, of each event. So for example, what am I expecting you to discuss? The Truman Doctrine. I would expect you to discuss the rebuilding of Europe, right, under the Marshall Plan. Okay, you have some evidence of that. I have a document that talks about the Marshall Plan. So I'm expecting you to talk about the rebuilding of Europe, okay? I'm expecting you to talk about the Korean War, okay? What happened in the Korean Peninsula, okay? I'm expecting you to talk about the crisis in Cuba with Fidel Castro with the failed invasion of Cuba, with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, okay? And of course, last but not least, I'm expecting you to talk about the Vietnam War, okay? Those are major, big, crucial, important events that I need you to discuss in details in your essay, okay? And do not make this mistake. Do not try to group all 4 of those events, all right, and throw it in one paragraph. It's not happening, guys, okay? You are not going to do that, okay? I'm letting you know right now, if you try to throw in, right, all of those events in one paragraph, you're gonna be in a lot of trouble, okay? Because those events are way too big for you to throw in one paragraph, because with each and every single one of those events, the Marshall Plan, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, you need to provide to me the context, okay? Like what was happening that caused this event to happen, okay? So you gotta give me the context, okay? Then you have to give me the description, the detailed description. Okay, what actually happened in the Korean War, right? And last but not least, you have to give me your analysis, right? So for example, if you talk about the Korean War, if the game plan, if the Truman Doctrine is to contain communism, well, does the Korean War prove that the Truman Doctrine was successful, or was it a failure, right? That is something you have to assess, right? And you have to make it clear to me. Don't just think that because you state in the thesis that, oh, well, these events show that the Truman Doctrine was a failure. Make sure you add that analysis in your paragraph, okay? So that's a key mistake, a common mistake that students made before. They would just tell me, well, you know, here's the Vietnam War, and ultimately America lost. Correlate it back to the essay prompt, right? How does the Vietnam War explain, right, whether America was successful or not, all right? And if it wasn't successful, here's another key component to you. You have to explain to me why America was not successful, or why it was successful, right, in terms of its effort to contain communism. So not only do you have to provide me the context, not only do you have to provide me the description, not only do you have to provide me the analysis, but you have to provide to me the explanation as to why, right, America succeeded or not. So for example, if you look at the Vietnam War, spoiler, yeah, it wasn't a success. America lost, right? But why? Why did America lose, right? What was wrong with their strategy? What was wrong with their process? So if you remember the Me Like documentary that you watched, right? In the video, think of the strategies that Charlie Company used as they went into the village, right? Do you think that was a good strategy, okay? And think about the strategies of the war itself, right? That this idea that you can just go into a place and just burn it to the ground, right? And just expect people to be on your side. That is a flawed strategy. So I'm expecting an analysis as to explain to me why it was success or not, okay? So that's what you're gonna be doing for. So pay close attention as you're following along, okay? So that's the first half of your paper. And if you look at the documents, right, I think it's straightforward that you have documents that is going to offer you, think of it as ultimately clues that I'm giving you to let you know, like, hey, you should talk about this event. So let's look at the first document here, okay? Here you have the first document. This is a map of the Korean War. All right, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'm not gonna spend 1,000 words to describe what you see here. This is quite clear and simple, me explaining to you, letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Korean War, right? And you should use this map in an effective manner. Don't just say, well, in document number 1, we see the Korean War. Yes, obviously, right? Think about what this map is showing to you, right? Think about somewhat the boundaries that are established, and think about what happened in Korea and the results of Korea, and why the Americans struggle a little bit when it came to Korea, right? That is not to say that they lost, but they had some challenges in Korea, right? So I want you to pay close attention to Korea. So this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Korean War. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Document number 6. okay? Document number 6, what you have here, this is the iconic image of the last helicopter out of the city of Saigon, right? The city of Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam. This is the last helicopter out of the US Embassy, right? This is April 30th, 1975. It's a dark day in Vietnamese American history. This was the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, and this is the last ticket out of town if you were on the American side. So with that said, this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Vietnam War, right? Give me a full analysis of the Vietnam War and ultimately how it correlates to the Truman Doctrine. How does it represent a failure in terms of the implementation of the Truman Doctrine itself, okay? And ultimately, let's see, what do we have here? Document number 8. Okay, document number 8, you have another speech by the Secretary of State, George Marshall, in 1947. He's outlining the goals of America when it comes to Europe, right? He is somewhat presenting America with a plan how to help people out in Europe. So ultimately, this is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Truman Doctrine in Europe, right? With the Marshall Plan itself, okay? So that's ultimately what you have, okay? And again, I really want to warn you ahead of time, do not try to throw in these events into one paragraph. You can't just mention them, right, in a few key terms. You have to give me a full analysis. And what that means is events like what? Rebuilding Europe, okay? The Korean War, okay? Now, I don't have a document in terms of Cuba, but if you look at the key terms, I got a few terms on Cuba itself. So I'm expecting a discussion of Cuba. And then last but not least, I'm expecting a full analysis of the Vietnam War. So if you look at it, that's 4 major events that defines the Truman Doctrine, okay? And with each one of those events, I would say I expect at least a good paragraph on every single one of those events. Because again, you can't just mention these events. You have to give me the context, the causes to these events, right? What happened at these events, okay? The description, right? You got to give me your analysis, whether or not these events represent a success or a failure of the Cold War. And last but not least, you also have to somewhat explain to me why, right? Why did America succeed and why did America somewhat fail, right, in terms of these events overseas. So I would say that is 4 big paragraphs that I'm expecting just on the Truman Doctrine overseas, okay? So I hope that's been clear to you in terms of what you should do. And again, just go in order, okay? Just go in order, looking at events in Europe first, and then moving to the Korean War, and then ultimately moving to the Cuba situation, and then last but not least, the Vietnam War. Because, guys, in history, nothing ever happens in a vacuum, okay? Every single one of these events are building on top of each other, okay? So ultimately, just go in order, and I think it just makes your job easier. Because at the end of the day, if you're gonna go against my recommendation, right, and if you're gonna try to do your own thing, you better have a good reason, and you better have a good logic as to why you are deviating, right, or not using my recommendation. Because in history, guys, don't overthink it, all right? It's about going in order. Because in history, it's about tracking change over time. And in order for you to track change over time, you gotta go in chronological order, right? So it's simple as that. If you wanna deviate from that, you wanna start with the Vietnam War, and then if you wanna go back in time to events in Europe and then move forward in time to Cuba, you better have a good reason as to why you are doing that. Because at the end of the day, this is a college paper, guys, so you need to write in an effective manner. And if you don't agree with my recommendation, then I need to see what is the logic behind your reasoning, because I can't think of another way why you would somewhat go out of chronological order. It just doesn't make sense, okay? So that's how you should set up your first half of your paper. So, okay, so that's the first half, okay? Now, I want to talk about the second half, okay? The second half of your paper should address how the Cold War inspired and influenced the civil rights movement back at home, and also the new right, movement, okay? So this is the reason why we are going to be shifting gears, right? The second half of your paper is going to be dealing with domestic events back at home, okay? And just to give you context as to why I'm asking you to do this, the Cold War itself was not just a war between two countries. It was a war of ideologies. It was a war of two societies, right? It was a war between one society that was capitalistic, free, democratic, against, right, a society that was communism and labeled as totalitarian, okay? So you got a battle. This is the ultimate battle between good and evil right here, right? Between those who want to live in a free society and those who want to live under a dictatorship. Or at least that was the way that it was presented to the American public, okay? Now, I know it's easy with hindsight to say that communism didn't work and it was the weaker of the two, but it was not quite so clear in the 1950s and 60s because communism was achieving great progress in terms of scientific achievements. Remember, the Russians were the first one to launch a satellite into space, right? And communism itself was very appealing to people around the world, especially those we call in the third world, right? Why do we call these places in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Asia the third world? It was said that after World War II, 1/3 of the world lived under American influence. The other 1/3 of the world lived under the Soviet influence, communism. And the last third, the third world, right, was undecided. These were the countries that were coming into age, achieving independence for the very first time from the European colonizers. So countries like India, in particular, Vietnam, Korea, okay, countries in Africa and the Middle East. So for the first time, they are experiencing freedom and independence, and they have to choose what society they want to live in. So ultimately, the Cold War itself is a competition for those countries, for their allegiance, for their cooperation, for their loyalty, right? And also for their labor, okay? Let's just keep it that way. So America is going to try to win them over, right? With the rhetoric of freedom, of liberty, and equality, right? Not the first time America made those promises, but it's going to somewhat be intensified, right? Bigger than before. And this was the backdrop and the promises of the Cold War that America made to other countries around the world. And that is how it inspires and emboldens African Americans back at home, right? To rise up against segregation and to fight for their rights. Because ultimately, the civil rights movement, historians argue that the civil rights movement would not have happened in the 1950s and 60s if it wasn't for the Vietnam War, right? Because think about it, guys. It's not the first time that you hear African Americans demanding for equality and freedom, but why is it that it's in the 1950s and 60s that you have this swelling, right, of activism, of protests, and also progress when it comes to African Americans and their civil rights, right? And it's simply because of that Cold War context, right? Because America was placed itself in that global spotlight, and everything it did underwent great scrutiny, right? Because the rest of the world is going to be looking at America to fulfill those promises back at home, right? And nobody's looking at what's happening back in America more closer than the Soviets themselves, than the communists, right? Than our enemies, because they want to hold racism, right, against America. So here, I want to show you some propaganda, right? That ultimately that the Soviets use, right, as a way to somewhat hold on, let me refresh this image 1 second here. as a way to somewhat hold America and to call America out for its hypocrisy. So what you see here is a painting. It's called The Shame of America, okay? And here you have an African-American. He's laying in a puddle of blood, and you got somewhat New York in the backdrop, okay? So that is to let you know that America is worried about its public image, right? Especially in the global stage, and nobody's holding them accountable for their promises than the Soviets themselves, and also African Americans back at home, because African Americans, right, are going to understand that ultimately, they have the tools, right, that they can use, right, at their somewhat advantage to fight for their rights, right, to fight against segregation, if you will. Keep in mind, this is also the era of television, right? So the reach to a global audience is easier than ever before. So African Americans, it's not lost upon them that they have this global audience. So as a result, they are going to use somewhat television as a way to communicate, right, this message across the world, okay? So as you read the documents, I want you to think very close about somewhat that correlation between what was happening overseas and how it shapes the civil rights movement back at home. And think about somewhat the hypocrisy that that African Americans and also the communists in Russia was trying to call America out in terms of its promises. So if you look at it, let's go with document number 2, okay? If you look at document number 2, here you have a document by Martin Luther King. And if you look at this document, it is a letter that was written by Martin Luther King from a jail in Birmingham. This is the Birmingham campaign of 1963. So, he's in jail, he's writing this letter. But what I really love about this passage is I really love how Martin Luther King makes that connection between what was happening, right, overseas in Asia, in Africa, and also what was happening back in America, right? So if you read it very carefully, there's a passage where he talks about just the first 2 sentences, right? He talks about, we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at lunchtime. I really love this document because, again, he is contrasting, he's comparing what's happening in places in Asia and in Africa, how those countries, right, how those people in those third world, right, are treated better, right, than African Americans back in America, which was the most powerful and richest country on earth. So that somewhat hypocrisy, that somewhat disparity between the third world and America was not lost upon Martin Luther King, okay? And let's see here. We have another document. I want to go with document. I love this document, document number 7. This is by Malcolm X, another influential leader of the civil rights movement, very different from Martin Luther King. And here he's making a speech. It's called The Ballot or the Bullet, okay? In which he is discussing the living conditions that African Americans in America had to endure, but more so, look at his explanation as to why African Americans were suffering from poverty and discrimination, right? And he writes very clearly. He says, all these people out here saying we shall overcome. He says, that's not the problem, right? He says, the problem is the government has failed us, right? The government has failed us. And he explains why, right? He explains why literally in the next sentence. He says, America is just as much a colonial power as England ever was, right? England, a great colonial power in the early 20th century. He says, America is just as much a colonial power as France ever was. So he's saying that America, it's similar, is exactly like those European colonizers. He says, in fact, America is even more so a colonial power than they, because she's hypocritical. She's a hypocritical colonial power behind it, right? He's calling out America because of its hypocrisy. Look at the year. It's 1964. And what was happening in 1964? You got the Civil Rights Movement. You got the March on Washington the year before. But you also have the escalation in Vietnam, okay? So think about how he views America's action overseas and how he views America's role, right, in terms of their treatment of African Americans back at home. So it's a powerful document. And I really love the connection between what's happening overseas and what's happening at home, right, in terms of African. So make sure you draw that connection. Document number 4, you have a document here. This is not by an African American. This is by Dwight Eisenhower. This is President Eisenhower, and he is addressing on the Little Rock situation, right, or the Little Rock incident. So this is part of his speech. And if you look at it, he's speaking about the Little Rock incident in which 9 African American students were not allowed to go to Central High. Yet despite his belief that Southerners will integrate the school itself, you really have to ask yourself the question, why did Eisenhower have to send in the National Guard to protect and to somewhat force integration, right, in these schools, if you will? What was he worried about when he says, there's a key passage here I want you to pay close attention. He says, our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation, okay? So think about that very clearly. What is he talking about, right? What incident, okay? And how is this incident being used to misrepresent America, right? The idea that America would, do you think it's a misrepresentation? I don't think it's a misrepresentation at all, because if you look at it, America was, if you look at Arkansas itself, they were the ones that refused to let the students in. So look, he's worried about communist propaganda. He's worried about how the Soviets are going to use, right, the refusal to integrate African-American students, right, as a criticism of America. And this is where I want to get to the next. I want to show you, right, this is a piece of Russian propaganda, right, to show that ultimately this is what Eisenhower worries about, right? He worries that the communists or the enemies is going to use the issue of civil rights as a way to somewhat to hold America accountable for its promises, okay? So ultimately, that's what this war is about, right? And if you think this is something new in the 1950s, it's not. The Soviets, they have been using somewhat segregation and the mistreatment of African Americans in their fight against America since day number 1. So if you look at it, this is another poster here during the 1930s to show that America is full of lies, that it's not fulfilling its promises. If anything, it's lynchings, it's exploiting African Americans, and it's killing African Americans. And this is why I say, communism was quite appealing, especially for people of color, right? So that's what you have, right? So ultimately, you're trying to figure that connection between how the Cold War influenced the civil rights movement in regard to the discourse, in regard to the narrative, the context that African Americans needed to fight against racism and segregation and allow them to achieve somewhat laws that are going to somewhat forever end segregation in America. You have 1964, the Civil Rights Bill, and 1965, the Voting Rights Act itself. So I'm looking for you to somewhat draw those connections, okay? And ultimately, and lastly, the last section of your paper should be to discuss how the Cold War itself shaped the New Right movement back at home, okay? The New Right movement itself, if you look at it, the Cold War itself didn't just inspire African Americans, but it also inspired another somewhat opposing group, if you will. These are white Americans. These are conservative, religious, evangelicals, white Americans living in the suburbs, okay? They too were inspired by somewhat the Cold War and the fight against communism overseas. And you can make a good argument that the New Right itself was a reaction to the civil rights movement very much how President Trump is a reaction to Obama, right? Because these folks who were living in the suburbs, they were known as the silent majority in 1968. They evolved into the new right by 1980s because the majority of them, right? This is the majority of the population were white. They didn't protest in the streets. They found the rhetoric of Black power to be very dangerous. Some even say it was reverse discrimination. They didn't burn their bras, right, to protest patriarchy like the feminists did, right? That is not to say that the feminists actually did. They didn't, but that was somewhat the criticism. And ultimately, these were nationalists. They didn't question somewhat their government, right? They didn't question somewhat their government's mission. If anything, they believed it, right? And anybody who questioned, right, their government is viewed as unpatriotic, okay? That's what you have in the New Right movement. They didn't like what they were seeing in the streets. They didn't like the fact that African Americans were burning up their cities. They didn't like that women, right, were protesting, right, at beauty pageants. They didn't like the fact that there were young, somewhat college students, right, not going to class, protesting, right, for their speeches. And you got the anti-war movement going on. So they view many of these things with great alarm. I mean, hell, you even have somewhat the view that Martin Luther King was a danger, right? Like when we think of Martin Luther King today, we think of Martin Luther King as like this great iconic, hero. Like, how can you be against him? But may I remind you that Martin Luther King in the 1960s was vilified as a communist, as a threat, right? So that's what you have, right? This fear against communism overseas, and also this fear against communism at home. And as a result, some of these folks in the New Right felt that their government needed to do more, or that the American people needed to somewhat rally behind their government. And as a result, the time had come to restore law and order, to put America back on the path to greatness. And you know what? I want to make a correction. The New Right did not want their government to do more. If anything, they wanted their government to do less, okay? Let's just put it that way, to do less, right? So they felt that ultimately the American people needed to rally behind the flag, to restore law and order in the streets, and to refocus the shift on fighting against communism overseas. So as a result, what you have is that you start with Richard Nixon in 1968. He really exploits this resentment among the white population in the suburbs. And as a result, he won the presidency in 1968. And he is going to lay the foundation, right, for the New Right movement, right, to become a national movement by the 1980s. And that guy who is going to somewhat become president because of the rise of the New Right, that guy is Ronald Reagan himself, right? This is President Reagan in 1980, because Ronald Reagan, when he ran for the presidency in 1980s, right, he did promise to put America on the path to greatness again. If anything, he came up with a very clever slogan, okay? Right? Now, if you thought that it was Trump who came up with the phrase, make America great again, like all Trumpian things, okay? It's a copy of somebody else's work, and he's trying to make money off of it, okay? Here you have a slogan, right, by Ronald Reagan in 1980s, and he's promising to let's make America great again, because he felt that America was somewhat divided, that America had lost its confidence. And ultimately, he wanted to shift the focus to, once again, to try to beat this evil empire that was communism, right? And as a result, by the 1980s, he really somewhat galvanized the New Rights, right? These religious evangelicals and white Americans in the suburbs. And ultimately, he becomes president because of the New Rights, okay? Now, if you look at the New Right itself, okay, their main focus is on defeating communism, okay, overseas. But they also want to fight communism back at home. And one of the ways how they try to fight communism is, again, they are viewing what's happening in streets with a lot of fear, okay? So they are viewing people in the streets with a lot of fear, particularly with African Americans, but also with the feminist movement, okay? So if you remember Phyllis Schlafly, okay, she's not a fan of feminism at all, right? She sees them as a threat. She believes like they are legitimately like communists, right? Because ultimately, you know, they don't follow somewhat the patriarchal society of America, okay? So ultimately, these folks, they want to fight communism at home, socially, but also politically, because what were African Americans and other minority groups demanding? That ultimately the government should expand and protect their rights, right? So it's an argument for larger government, expansion of government, right? Through civil rights laws and also through work programs and welfare measures, if you will, okay? The problem with that is some people, especially in the new rights, interpret any argument for larger government as a step to communism. Because the idea in a communist society, the government owns everything. The government controls everything, right? And the larger the government in America, people in the new right fear that. They see government as not the solution, but the problem, right? And that ultimately, right, America needed to go back to the old ways of smaller government. And this is what you have with Ronald Reagan. He begins a process of deregulation, and there is somewhat an effort to try to reverse some of the accomplishment of the civil rights movement and also the feminist movement, if you will, right? So I'm looking for you to somewhat understand the new rights, how they came about, right? Their objective, right? And some of the policies that ultimately they came up during somewhat the Cold War era, if you will, okay? So ultimately, that's what you have, okay? That's what you have to do: discuss, define, explain the success and your failures of the Truman Doctrine overseas in Europe, Latin America, and Asia, and how the Cold War influenced and inspired the civil rights movement and also the new right movement back at home, okay? So again, first half of your paper, focus on the Truman Doctrine overseas and go in chronological order, right? Europe, Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. Just go in that order, okay? And don't forget to provide the context, the details, and to make it very clear to me whether or not each one of those events were a success and a failures based on the objective of the Truman Doctrine, okay? So that's the first half of your paper. And the second half of your paper should be about how the Cold War influenced the two movements back at home, how African Americans used the discourse, the democratic promises, and America's action overseas to hold America accountable to its own citizens, right, back at home, and push for civil rights bill and an end to segregation. And lastly, how the Cold War influenced and shaped the new right movement among white Americans in the suburbs as they try to fight against larger government and try to reverse some of the gains from the civil rights movement in their effort against Black power, feminism, and anti-war protesters to make their country great again, okay? Now, I apologize if this video went for a little too long, but I just want to give you as much information as I can. So again, I hope this video has been clear to you what I expect you to do on the final exam and how your paper should be organized. Now, if you have any questions, anything you want to address to me, feel free to reach out to me and schedule a video chat. I'd love to help you whatever I can. So don't hesitate, guys. But other than that, don't forget, right? Essay, organize, detail, at least 1,000 words, and 6 documents, okay? And all of the key terms, okay? Do not forget. And ultimately, yeah, guys, you're almost there. You are almost there, right? You got 15% more of the class to go. So ultimately, do not let up, okay? Stay focused, set aside as much time as possible to get it done, because this is not the first time, but the third time you will be taking a test in my class. So you know exactly what my expectations are. So I hope you have found this video to be informative and insightful in terms of what I'm expecting you to do. And I hope that it has helped you somewhat in preparation for the assignment. But other than that, I hope that you review somewhat this video, the content in module 9 and 10, and also think about somewhat my critique of midterm number 1 and 2, right? And make those adjustments, okay? Make those adjustments and ultimately get this assignment done, guys, before the due date, all right? You're almost there. And as always, happy learning in my class, guys. And if you need help, feel free to reach out to me. Do not hesitate, all right? All right. Good luck, guys. Thank you.